Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video, my penultimate video for 2022. This is my final wrap up of what I've been reading. There might be a couple more books I finish before the end of the year, but they'll just have to be reviewed in next year. And then my final video of the year will be my books of the year for 2022, which I will probably get out with a bit of luck on the 30th, maybe the 31st. Anyway, so 5 books I've completed. The Club of Angels by Brazilian author Luis Fernando Verissimo, and this was translated by Margaret Coste. The Revolution, according to Raymundo Matter by Gina Apostol, Filipino writer. Gilbert Adair, The Dreamers. Jonathan Lethem, As She Climbed Across the Table. And finally a book of poetry, Voyage of the Sable, Venus and Other Poems by Robin Coste Lewis. And just to say that the first and last of those, The Club of Angels and Voyage of the Sable, Venus, was sent to me by a long-time commentator on my channel, Mitchell Axler from over in the US. Mitchell, thank you very much. He also sent me 2 other books which I haven't got round to reading yet. Okay, so we may as well start with the Verissimo. And what an absolute delight this was. So the Club of Angels refers to a dining club of guys who all grew up together in Brazil. They were all from fairly reasonably well-off families, maybe bourgeois, but none of them have quite made it in life, lived up to the sort of starting life that they were given with education and comfort and stuff. But the one thing they've kept throughout their sort of friendships together, their falling outs, but they've kept up this dining club. And the head of the dining club was not one originally of their sort of friend circle. He was an older gentleman who sort of brought them all together, and he always gave the address at every one of the meetings. But he died of a heart attack, so the club was sort of slightly floundering about whether it should still continue. The wives and girlfriends started coming, and that sort of caused ructions. When the book opens, the main character, who is a sort of a lapsed writer, he meets a guy called Lucidio, who sort of enchants him with his tales of his travels across the world, including his time in Japan when he was training to be a fugu chef. And fugu is that very, very poisonous puffer fish, but when handled properly, the food from it is, or the meat from it is sort of one of the sort of most exquisite meals you can have in the world, allegedly. But there is always a risk attendant to it, because, you know, if it's not prepared properly, then the poison may very well kill the person who eats it. Anyway, so the protagonist is so impressed with Lucidio that he sort of invites him to be the chef, to cater for the next dining club, which is at Lucidio's house. And Lucidio agrees, and all the guys assemble, and there's just enough of the main course for one more portion. So one of the guys, it's his favourite meal, so he asks if he can have that extra portion, and later that evening he winds up dead of a heart attack. I think you can see where this is going. So gradually, one by one, they're basically being bumped off after a meal, and presumably the Lucidio has got something to do with it. You know, he's talked about poison fish, and you know these men aren't entirely stupid. They work out that they're being bumped off, and that's probably by Lucidio, and it's probably by poison, which will be made to look like a heart attack. But the paradox that they have is that they still want to taste this divine food in the same way as fugu meat is so divine. They are prepared to give up their lives for this divine rendition of their favourite food. And why, you know, there are all sorts of interesting questions as to why they succumb. It's because, are they failures, and this could be the apotheosis of their life, to at least have this exquisite desire of food met. It's a really interesting inquiry into those things. And you know, there are the disquisitions on the surviving members. You know, we know what's happening, and yet we still succumb to it. All this, but it's the tone of it is still quite light. It reminded me a bit of G.K. Chesterton in a way, of his book, The Man Who Was Thursday, which I can highly recommend, by the way. It had that sort of vibe about it, but this was an absolute pleasure. I breezed through it. It's not a very long book, 5 stars. And on to The Revolution According to Raymundo Matter by Gina Apostol. This is my 3rd Apostol novel. They've all been not unreasonably about Filipino history. It's Quest for Independence, and her other books are sort of post-independence, sort of contemporary Philippines, which this is indirectly. So Raymundo Matter was if he's a real person at all, he may be a fictional person, but in here he was a 19th century supporter of Filipino independence from the Spanish, who were the colonial masters. But the Spanish were in trouble because they were at war with the Americans, and the Americans saw the chance to kick the Spanish out of places like Cuba and the Philippines and to take those colonies over for themselves. And the time of Filipino sort of independence was really sort of kicked into gear by a novel by an author called Jose Rizal. Now, this much is fact. This is non-fiction, and this is written as Matter, who sort of came into the orbit of Rizal, which I'll get into. It's sort of his very minor character contribution to the revolution. So Jose Rizal wrote this book, novel, which was very anti-clerical and was sort of passed around almost like samizdat amongst Filipinos. And it sort of became a clarion call to rise up and throw off their Spanish taskmasters. Because it was anti-clerical, obviously Spain was totally dominated by the Catholic Church, even though the Philippines is still a very religious country. And Rizal is imprisoned by the Spanish, and he's sent to exile, still within the Philippines, but one of the sort of more remote islands. And Matter is part of a plan to basically bust him out there. But he's not one of the active commandos who's going to do it. He's the beard, in a way, the excuse, because Rizal was a Renaissance man, had many arrows to his bow, apart from novelist, doctor, engineer, all this sort of stuff. And so the insurrectionists plan to send a sympathetic doctor in the movement to take Raymundo Matter, who has night blindness, so has sort of severe seeing problems, and they are going to supposedly consult with Jose Rizal, who's a doctor. And so, as I say, Matter is a minor character in this bigger plot of Philippine independence. So that's the plot of the book, really. It's presented as Matter's journal, slightly fragmented, because he's reconstructing it retrospectively when he himself is in prison for being a revolutionary, but he's in an American prison. The Spanish have gone, the Americans have taken over, his one actual contribution to the revolution was to pick up a rifle and to fight the Americans in one battle, but he got captured and he was put in prison. So already he's an unreliable narrator because he's looking back at his life. It's a fragmentary record. He uses several different languages: Spanish, Tagalog, which is one of the Filipino languages, but also the secret revolutionary language, a slang which is sort of part Spanish, part Tagalog and other vernaculars within the Philippines, and a bit of English. So that brings us to the three main characters of this book, because it's not, Matter obviously looms large, but the three main characters are contemporary, and this is where the action of the book happens, not these sort of revolutionary events. So we have a translator, we have a very, very patriotic pro-Filipino historian, and we have a Western, I assume American, but maybe not, a Western literary critic who comes from the school of psychoanalytic literary theory. And they are at war. In the footnotes, the action of this novel takes place in the footnotes, and I'll come back to whether that you might think that's off-putting or not. So they are slagging each other off, denying their interpretation. So what you realise, it's already an unreliable journal, but it's presented as history, as a historical document, and these three are showing that, well, if it's history, it's a narrative, and if it's a narrative, it's open to interpretation, it's open to analysis, and they're all coming from it from a different strata. So the translators are coming to it from a linguistic strata, trying to sort of provide all the sort of slangy and vernacular and all this sort of stuff. The patriot is fiercely defending the memory of Jose Rizal, the father of the revolution, and the American critic is very hostile to both of them. The Filipino patriot, she has abasia, which means that she's basically bedbound in a sanatorium. Whereas the American critic, every time she posts a footnote, it's got a different place around the world that she's sort of jetted off to as part of her intellectual inquiries or her lecturing and stuff. But I think this is fabulous. I think it's very, very... It reminded me in some ways of Laurent Binet's HHHH, because it's a disquisition into history and historical record and how much can we rely on it for fact. And all of that is thrown into the air by the sort of the clash of original record and modern. Even within the moderns, that there's three different people going at different interpretations. It's just fabulous. Now, you might feel that a book which is told largely in footnotes, even more than David Foster Wallace's The Infinite Jest, it will be hard going just because your eyes have to keep going from the bulk of the page down to the footnotes. And I understand that, but actually the way this is structured by Apostol is actually, it's very easy because the line breaks and the page breaks are very sympathetically done. So you don't keep having to, your eye doesn't have to keep travelling back or up or whatever. It's all rather splendidly done. And, this was my third Apostol book, and I think this may even be the best yet. I absolutely loved it. 5 stars. And on to The Dreamers by Gilbert Adair. So this was a very curious reading experience. It starts off in a really interesting way where Matthew is an American student who's studying abroad in Paris. He befriends a set of French twins who are at his university, Isabel and Theo. And what binds them together is their love of movies. That virtually every day they go to this sort of art movie house in Paris, which sort of has different films every day. And the cinema is shut down by order of the culture minister, André Malraux, the writer, who was actually the culture minister under one of the French governments. I don't know if the actual shutting down of this cinema was a true event, but that's what happens in the book. And it's shut down because the owner is very unpopular within the industry because he doesn't bother sort of returning film reels. He stores them in his house in the bathtub, which they think is A, disrespectful, and B, not the best way to preserve these things. So they put pressure on Malraux's ministry, and in the end they shut the cinema down. Well, the students are appalled. What are they going to do now? They spend every day together at the cinema. And Matthew suddenly sort of says, well, why don't we hang out together? Why don't I go to your house? Because all the time that he's known them, he's never shared a meal with them, apart from sort of sandwiches. He's never seen their house. And they go, oh, yeah, that's not a bad idea. So he goes to their house, meets their parents, and the parents are going away. And they say that why doesn't he, it's a rich house, it's got a separate wing for the kids. Why doesn't Matthew stay with them while the parents are out? So that's what happens. And they invent this game called the movie game, where things that crop up in life, like an image or an event that happens, someone will make a connection in their head to a scene in a movie where similar, if not the same, has happened. And they'll go, right, what movie, or name me movies where, what just happened. And there are forfeits if you don't get it. And the forfeits are small amounts of money. But gradually these build and build. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say that there's an incestuous relationship between the twins. And now Matthew gets sucked into... Matthew is very repressed. He's not out of the closet. He has a thing for Theo. But part of the forfeits is he first ends up with Isabel. So it's a world of incest, it's a world of film, it's a world of fantasy. It's all quite claustrophobic and an interesting atmosphere. And then they sort of get the the sex and the forfeit sort of dominates and kicks out everything else from their lives. They can't even be bothered to go shopping for food. Their parents are delayed and aren't coming back for a longer time. And they totally get cut off from what's happening in the outside world. They basically never leave the house. Until one day a paving stone comes through and shatters one of their windows, and they look outside to see, what's caused this. And basically this is 1968 Paris. And the student uprising, where the students allied with the factory workers and built barricades and all this sort of stuff. And it's sort of implied that one of the sort of sparky events of that was the shutting down of this cinema. So I don't know if that's true or not. And these three sort of finally snap back into reality, and they go out on the streets. They're not particularly politically motivated. They're not particularly into the ideas of this uprising, but when they see people beaten with batons or women being set upon by the police, then they do what any human would do and intervene, and that way they get caught up in it without the ideology being attached to it. So it's called The Dreamers, but it's two very different tones to this book. You've got the sort of cut off from reality part one, which is interesting in itself. But then you go into this sort of hyper-realistic, although maybe it's supposed to be filmic, the scenes of sort of rioting on the streets, I don't know. And those two don't seem to merge together at all well, certainly not seamlessly. And I read there's an afterword from Adair where he sort of says that this book was called something else originally. It was his first completed novel. He wasn't quite satisfied with it. I assume it got published. But it always gnawed at him for 20-odd years, and he kept turning down offers for it to be filmed because he wasn't satisfied with his original version. And eventually Bernardo Bertolucci came a-knocking, and he says, well, I can't turn this guy down. So Adair gets the gig not only to have his book adapted for the movie, but he's the one doing the adaptation and changes it. Now, I haven't read the original, so I don't know why he's changed, but I don't know if both these different tones, wildly different tones, which I assume are in the movie, I don't know if they were in the original novel, but it seems like they've been sort of jammed together and it doesn't work. So, as I say, a very curious experience, 3 stars. On to Jonathan Lethem, As She Climbed Across the Table, one of his earlier sort of literary genre books in sci-fi. So Alice Coombs is a physics professor at an American uni, and her boyfriend Philip Engstrand is also a professor, but he's in interdisciplinary arts, sort of social science and arts. So they've been together for quite a while, but they're in quite separate disciplines. And in the science department in this university, Professor Soft is trying to basically recreate or model the Big Bang, or how the Big Bang might have worked in miniature. And what he's trying to do is create a universe from nothing, which will be like in a bubble, and then that bubble will break off and form another universe. Only it never breaks off, the bubble never breaks off, but he has created something. What it seems to be is a void, because things can pass through this void, everyday objects like paper clips or fruit or whatever, and most of them just get spat out the end of the void. They just pass through, but some things the void keeps and disappears and retains. So this is worthy of study, and it falls to Alice basically to head up research into this. And Alice basically falls in love with whatever this thing is. She keeps offering herself to it, hoping she'll be absorbed, but she keeps getting spat out. She does more and more desperate things, and of course that affects her relationship with Philip, who is desperately trying to cling on to her. He sees he's losing her to this thing, and of course he's struggling to understand what's involved and what emotions this thing is sort of appealing to in her. And as more and more things are sort of tested as to what this thing accepts, and there's no sort of rhyme or reason, it'll accept pomegranates but it won't accept plums, or that kind of thing. Other people become sort of involved in the project, and they too fall in love with this void. The only person who doesn't fall in love with it is Philip, because it's caused him sort of grief and pain. And I think it's not they fall in love with it for its own sake, it's they don't want to be rejected. They don't, this embodiment of things passing through it and being spat out the other side, it's a form of rejection. And I think the characters, they're so sort of self-obsessed. It's more about not wanting to be thinking that they're the one who's not going to be rejected. So it is asking some very interesting questions about subjectivity versus objectivity. And Philip, because he's from outside the science disciplines, he brings in one of his sort of professor mates from the interdisciplines, who says, look, you're approaching this from the laws of physics, which are, that is a subjectivity that you're bringing to this problem of what this thing is. We regard it as a text, and therefore we have to make the text speak for itself in its own terms. We must not bring in any subjectivity. There must be no author, no ideas from outside. We have to interpret what this thing is. So there's, again, this clash of sort of the nature of knowledge and inquiry. And it goes on and develops. I won't spoil the end. But I love some of the ideas in this book, but it's very curious. First of all, the relationships involved with the various characters were not very interesting. When you get towards the ending, it's all about relationship. It's not about the void at all anymore, which is perfectly legitimate, but it's just not as engaging. And there's something, for such big ideas, there's something very small about this book, small in the sense of being self-contained. It is its own world. And if you try and extrapolate and draw out of that world to think about things in our world, you don't get very far. So I really enjoyed it, but I only got so far with it. It's a bit like a sort of a fast food meal, which leaves you hungry again in an hour. So I give this 4 stars, mainly for the quality of its ideas. And finally, Voyage of the Sable Venus by Robin Coste Lewis, American poet. This is in 3 parts. Parts 1 and 2 are various poems, and then part 2 is a sort of a conceptual poem, which I'll come to. But I'll just read a couple of very brief things from the other poems, a couple of stanzas from 2 different poems. This is from Beauty's Nest. Beauty's nest renders the body mute, an elegance so inconceivable it's violent, extreme. It hurts the heart to see something so vast and deep can also be made of dirt. And then this is the first stanza of a poem called Let Me Live in a House by the Side of the Road and Be a Friend to Man. In their heaven, God is a politician who can't get enough votes to be the dog catcher. So, this lady can write. But the middle section, which is the eponymous one, is where she has gone round many, many museums in the world and noted down exhibits which involve black and African and Caribbean and even sort of earlier sort of primitive sculptures or drawings or in sort of, lace work, wherever they're drawn from. And she's noted down what they are, and she's noted down the title. And a lot of these are untitled. And that's what the poem consists of, is the names of these works of art or the reported state of them, like arm missing or head missing or whatever. And it becomes, so it's concrete poetry, it's found poetry, but it becomes so effective as to both how blackness has been erased throughout history and art, and also she's in a way reasserting its primacy through the fact that it's such an old sort of tradition within art that there are these archetypal figures, and the Voyage of the Sable Venus refers to an artwork which if you're familiar with that poem, that painting where Venus is emerging from the clamshell. The Voyage of the Sable Venus was originally done by an artist as a bit of a spoof of that, but with a black Venus. And actually it's transcended the spoof nature of the painting and became quite iconic in its own way. And it's that sort of image that's at the heart of it. So this is terrific. I mean, this is really powerful stuff. 4.5 stars. And that's it. That's my last wrap-up for 2023. As I say, I'll be doing my top reads, including all my reading stats for the year. I've read 144 books in all, including these ones. I've got 2 which I put down at various points in the year that I haven't gone back to yet, but will next year. I've got 1 I'm currently... I've started it last week. I don't think it's quite thick and quite slow going, so I don't think I'll finish it before the year end. So again, that will just be coming to my first review next year. So I'd just like to thank everybody for all the support, the wonderful comments and insights, and particularly recommendations that I've had for my channel this year, people recommending me books. So thank you to everyone. I've also been very, very gratified that I've had 5 or 6 authors of books I've reviewed, poetry and novels, have actually commented either in my YouTube, either underneath the video, or via Goodreads or via Twitter. And that's very, very gratifying. I even had an author thank me for my review, even though I didn't like her book. And I thought that was incredibly gracious of her. And there was one week where I'd reviewed 4 books, and 2 of the authors reached out to me to thank me. So I was really tickled by that. And as someone who, you know, when you have a booktube channel and you get that kind of feedback from the people that you're reviewing, even ones where you haven't liked their work particularly, that's really, really heartening. And then when you add in all the thank yous that I've had from you guys, you know, the readers who aren't writers, it's the best thing you can get. That plus recommendations for other reading, but that's the best thing you know a booktuber could possibly get as a response to their channel. So thank you to everyone. Here's to a good 2023, but do look out for my best reads of 2022. So till then, thanks very much.